hang on a minute, what kind of attack on NATO in the late 2020s are we talking about? Putin is stuck in East Ukraine, and it looks like staying stuck is the best thing he can achieve with help from North Korea. And the only movement of significance we've seen in recent months has been when Wagner marched on Moscow. Well, here is the deal. The two motivations with which Putin starts the war in Feb 2022 are now even more entrenched than they were back then. Now, Putin's first motivation for war is regime security. War brings Putin regime security, Putin thinks. And you might say, well, Putin thinks that, but I don't. I think that his view that the war enhances his regime security is so silly, given how badly his war is going, that eventually he's going to have to change his mind. Now, for one, let's not get ahead of ourselves about tyrants changing their mind. Humans are bad at changing their mind, and the worst predicament for changing your mind is to be in the position of a tyrant. Isolation and grandiosity breed delusion. But much more significantly, here is what we have to understand. Putin is not comparing today with war and today without war. He's comparing 2025 or 2027 with war versus 2025, 2027 without war. And in Feb 2022, he wasn't comparing Russia with war versus Russia without war. He was looking to the future. He thought that Belarus 2020 could be Russia 2027. The biggest divide in Russia is generational, and Putin was, and felt he was, losing the younger generation. In other words, millions of younger Russians are civically equidistant between older Russians and us, Westerners. Now, we shouldn't exaggerate this, they're not like us, but they're somewhere in the middle. And that's a huge problem for Putin, because these are people who don't necessarily feel in love with liberal democracy, but they're people who feel that this is weird, that this bizarre monarch, who seems to be the only political institution in town, runs the show here. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't feel legitimate. It feels weird. Now, the second justification for war is inevitable, existential, civilizational conflict with the West. Putin thinks he must, capital M, propel Russia from the back row of nations right to the front in a single swoop, challenging NATO's Article 5 at a moment when NATO is too weak to respond, perhaps in 2028. And here it's important to distinguish between Kremlin's lies and Kremlin's endless post-truth and fanatical sincerity. Because when they issued their ultimatum before the war, they were genuinely claiming proprietorial control over Eastern Europe and demanding effectively the dissolution of NATO. They meant it.
Immediate guarantees
now,
from the US.
We've done the run-through, and I want to hold you because I know that this question, but how still is he going to do this escalation against NATO in 2028, is still with us. And to take it on properly, we've got to ask and answer 6 basic questions that clarify much more deeply these two motivations that we've put on the table, how they translate into Putin's plans for escalation. Does Putin think that his war in Ukraine is defensive? What on earth are we talking about? What kind of defensive war when he lined up his army and then marched in? But you see, for Putin, that he invaded Ukraine, or that he even began his invasion in 2014, is only a kind of accountant's truth, as Werner Herzog might say. The real, deeper truth is that he is simply fighting a defensive war. And now imagine that there is no war, and Putin in 2026 faces what Lukashenko faced in 2020. If at that time Ukraine is independent, which for Putin means is an outpost of US imperialism, that will be for Putin an existential threat to his regime. He'll think an existential threat to his life too, because he's so haunted by images of Saddam's end and Gaddafi's end. And in his mystically contorted view of reality, it'll be an existential threat to Russian culture too. And you might think going like that when I talk about Putin is disrespectful toward an evil but major global leader. And it's not. Because the bottom line we're emphasizing here is that you go potty when you endlessly sit at the top of regimes like that. This nicely leads us to the second question. Does Putin think that anybody in Russia actually opposes him? Does he think he has any organic opposition in Russia? And the answer to that is no, because all domestic opposition is for Putin merely an expression of malign foreign interference in Russia's affairs. And interestingly here we begin to see a kind of coming together of the regime security motivation for war and the business of overturning the West on the largest global stage. They come together because any domestic opposition for Putin is effectively the West trying to get him. The third question is, does Putin think that East European countries' sovereignties are real? Now, he doesn't approach East European countries with the same genocidal rhetoric with which he approaches the supposed non-existence of Ukraine in Putin's delusional perception. Ukrainians, he does genuinely claim, aren't real because they are Russians suffering from false consciousness. And as soon as they awaken from it, normally that will happen by extricating them from the grasp of US imperialism. But once that happens, they'll realize there's no such thing as Ukrainians, really. They're just Russian. There is no such genocidal rhetoric about Eastern Europe. About Eastern Europe, Putin just thinks that the sovereignty of these countries is sort of toy sovereignty. When it's stress-tested by history, it'll just vanish. And what this means is that the United States and West European powers aren't really committed to Eastern Europe deep down in Putin's eyes. As the political philosopher Greg Udin likes to say, Putin thinks that the Americans know deep down that Eastern Europe isn't theirs. So it's a kind of idea that the United States knows is sort of encroached into Putin's garden, and if Putin asks them to clear off, they won't. But as soon as he puts up a real fight, they'll remember that this stuff isn't really theirs, and they'll clear away. Now question 4. Is Putin resetting the Russian economy for a long-distance war? And is he reorienting the Russian education system for a large-scale civilizational tussle with the West? Yeah, he is. I think the details would take us into a second video inside a video. So the only point worth emphasizing here is that this requires Putin to keep balancing depoliticization of the population with politicization. And that's not just a precarious balance, it's also a balance he can't entirely control. And here we really, with deep gratitude, outsource ourselves to country experts who are going to tell us both what's going on with the Russian people month by month, and also going to tell us what Putin's capacity is to start politicizing to some greater extent Russia's depoliticized population. Now question 5. Does Putin believe that NATO's Article 5 can be successfully tested? Yep. And that's not just because of what he perceives as our inauthentic commitment to Eastern Europe. It's also because he believes that we are in democratic decline. And he believes that with the kind of teleological faith that some of us in 1989 believed in the Fukuyamian idea of the globalization of democracy. For Putin, it's the same inexorable historical process. Yes, Western democracy is here today, but give or take a few years, it won't last. And so his view is, yeah, if I challenge Article 5 in 2024 by invading Estonia, that's not going to go well for me. But in 2027 and 2028, it might go well. These aren't fairy tales, because ever since Putin took his civilizational turn around 2010 to 2014, it became increasingly apparent that a foreign gambit might be in order. There's a video on this channel from a year or two before the war speculating about this. It's not completely inconceivable that Putin gets involved in the Baltic states in the next 5 years. So Putin is not thinking of a big war with NATO. He is thinking of a challenge to NATO from which NATO, wrecked by democratic weakness at home, runs away. That's really a large part of the answer. How can Putin fight a war against the West when he needs help from North Korea to entrench himself in East Ukraine? Question 6. Has Putin's conviction weakened since the war, and is he rational? I don't think it has weakened, and that's because he feels that all that's happened has only further proven that the West is out to get him and out to get Russia. And if anything, there is an element of relief he might feel, which goes something like this. Well, yes, in the end, these baddie Westerners aren't really committed to Ukraine or really committed to Eastern Europe, but extricating them out of here is a bit harder than I expected, and it's good that I know that. Now, is this strengthening of conviction in Putin rational? I think it is. It's possible to have a distorted picture of the world, but to go about the world rationally by rigorously asking questions about what you're doing, by reflecting on how best to take the next step. You see, Joe Biden might be more truthful in his picture of the world and less deluded than Putin. But is Joe Biden's strategy for Russia more thought through than Putin's strategy for America? I don't think so. I think Putin's strategy is more reflectively robust than our strategy against him. So all that helps us see Putin. But what about us seeing ourselves? Well, we do have an incomplete strategy, but it's a strategy toward Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And that is that Ukraine must remain independent, even if it loses territory, and that the war must not escalate and must not nuclearly escalate, above all. But that position is more hopeful than hard-nosed. It's more appropriate to a world in which Putin starts a dreadful war in Eastern Europe. But it's less appropriate to a world in which Putin starts a war in Eastern Europe as an initial step of a wider and existential and mystically motivated escalation against the West. You see, we are operating as though Putin is a problem for our security, while we are actually in a world in which Putin is a direct attack on our security. Now, do you want to know how the war might end? I think we might get away with it, but not because Putin doesn't have bigger plans of escalation beyond Ukraine, not because we have a good strategy to defeat him, but because history is unpredictable and regimes are fragile and Putin might mistime his gambit. So Putin might well trip up. But if he doesn't trip up, he isn't going to stop until we stop him. And here we reach uncomfortable waters, because it's coming to seem that, at least in one respect, Putin sees us better than we see him. He sees Western leaders better than they see him. He perceives, with exaggeration, their weakness, but they don't perceive entirely his pattern of escalation. And here we got to talk about ourselves, but wisely. Our political leaders are not stupid, except the many who are and are completely inadequate for political office. But on the whole, our political leaders are not stupid. They are facing a paradox. Responding to Putin requires reimagining the international order into a more functional shape of the kind it hasn't had for a long time. But doing so requires a degree of stability and a degree of solidarity in our domestic politics. And that's something that we are increasingly lacking. And a lot of politicians say, look, I'm going to entrepreneurially exploit our breakdown of solidarity by fueling it further to ride into office. But that doesn't mean that decent politicians who exist can pull us out of this predicament with a moral rallying cry. Joe Biden can't just say, come on, man, the thingy thing, Western powers, let's get it together. To think that that's possible is a misunderstanding of our democratic capacity. So what we need anyway, and to defeat Putin too, is to explore why we're losing democratic capacity and use that understanding to have a go at partly restoring it. Without that, the best we can hope for is that Putin trips over, which he might well do, while we sit here without a complete strategy to defeat him. And to grasp this vital connection between democratic decline on the one hand and a chronic lack of strategy, a failing global order, watch this video next. It's perhaps the most important one I've shared.